And so this idea of seeing ourselves as islands, as cut off, as independent of one another, as separate of one another versus the totality of a body of islands and the connecting waters in between. So that's something that I received upon moving here. It's not looking at water o el charco as the separation between us, sino los puentes, lo que nos conecta, what that fluidity that we must embody. Like Bruce Lee says, right? Be water, that fluidity that we must embody to transcend this idea of smallness, of inferiority that's been imposed on us by colonialism. Saludos and welcome to the Rematriating Boriken podcast, where we discuss the journey to the essence of these islands, this archipelago and her surrounding waters, the restoration of our essence before conquest and continued colonialism, the reclamation of our collective healing and liberation. I am Yasmín Hernández, creator of CucubaNación, artist, writer, activist, born and raised in Brooklyn, Rematriating Boriken. I'm posting this 4 days after the full moon, the October 17, 2024 full moon in Aries. It is said that the full moon energy lasts maybe around 3 days before, 3 days after. So we're like past that energy. And this was a really heavy full moon, which brought a lot of stuff that started, like there's stuff that we've buried, emotional stuff, those feelings that we may not have wanted to feel, that we've suppressed. We do that when we're not mindful of doing that. A lot of things came up, and this time there's a lot of stuff surfacing. And it's like very creepy Halloween kind of feel. And so I, in these moments, give myself the space, right? I'm trying to define my own timelines now and not be so bound by the calendars and bound by other people's schedules and deadlines y esa cosa. This moon that just passed was closing out, right, on its own time, whatever was coming up for us with the solar eclipse of back in April 8th of 2024. I remember clearly because that's my son's birthday, and that's also the birthday of Ramón Emeterio Betances, Padre de la Patria, aquí, Puerto Rico. And so whatever themes were coming up back around April 8th, those are the things that we are kind of bringing to a completion or escalation or elevation or further awareness. Now, I need to clarify that I am not an astrologer, and this is not an astrology podcast. My grandfather was an astrologer among many other different spiritual modalities that he worked. But it was around the time that my child that I just mentioned, April 8th, Aries, first son, who I birthed at home. Both were born at home, but that first experience of being pregnant, working with a midwife, it was through my midwife, Sakina Oyuhu, that I learned about the lunar calendar and working with the lunar calendar and having a line of midwives in my maternal lineage. Once I discovered that and went through that process, it awoke all these ancestral memories in me. So back from New York City, I was already synchronizing with the phases of the moon, which is something that we women and all humans do anyway with our cycles. And so something that's important to just be more aware of. And so that is why I post these podcasts on or around the new and full moons, because this is a podcast about rematriation and reconnecting to the essence of this homeland of ours. It's important to me that I'm honoring some of the sacred practices of our ancestors, like working in synchronicity with the moon, So, for example, our agricultural practices, to this day, there are people that will plant with the moon, as should always happen, right? Como por ejemplo, una mata de plátano o de guineo, depending on those moon phases, just like us and how the tides swell and, liquids in our own bodies swell. You can't cut and transplant a plant that is engorged with water. You have to know where that moon is and where that plant is along that moon phase to know when is the most optimum time to cut it and transport it. So whatever, esto es for people listening, wherever people are listening from. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're planting stuff, but by virtue of the fact that we are living on this planet and we have this moon, as we can see with the tides, there is an influence, and I like to honor that influence. But today's podcast is about the theme of archipelago, archipelago in español, being just a cluster of islands. And that is what Puerto Rico is, moving away, very important, from the singular identity that seeks to diminish us as smaller than what reality is that we're way more expansive than colonialism would like to label us and condition us to believe. And so with this podcast today, this episode, we are honoring that concept of the archipelago, the cluster of islands that we know today as Puerto Rico, which is actually part of the greater cluster of islands that comprises the Antilles, the whole Caribbean, the greater Caribbean. Last year, the rematriation gatherings that we started at CucubaNación were spaces that were specifically for diaspora folks to come together, be able to speak freely without being criticized for how we speak Spanish or for speaking English, y esa cosa. But where it's headed now con esta, lo que llamo trinchera de ideas, which is a quote by José Martí, que vale más una trinchera de ideas que una trinchera de piedras, a trench of ideas versus a trench of rocks. And so each month, on the third Thursday of each month at 5 o'clock in CucubaNación, we have a conversation for Boricuas from wherever. Don't have to be from the diaspora, and even diaspora has 800 meanings at this point. But a space, a transcendent space for Boricuas, whether we came here born or raised elsewhere, or those born and or raised here who have always been here, who have had to leave and return, whatever your business, whatever your path, the commonality be this desire, this commitment to reconnect and align and uphold the essence of this place and of the land. Every time we gather each month, third Thursdays, it's going to have a different theme. So the first one we did it was in July, conquest, and that one was the theme of El Monte. Last year we had done a couple of gatherings around water, the theme of specifically salt water, seawater. And so it's just a series of what are the lessons that we are connecting to when we listen to the land. How do we start documenting, exchanging? What I'm finding is that the medicine seems to be coming from the land itself. We talk about the ancestral wisdom, but what about the wisdom of the land itself, the islands themselves, and the waters that surround them? And that is what I feel that I have been able, how I was most marked in my rematriation journey after my move here, was going from a place in which my liberation struggle was rooted in political activism, in studying, right, reading, knowing our history, knowing our more contemporary liberation struggle, the concepts of leaders and freedom fighters, y eso, y es una base, y es algo sumamente importante que hay que saber siempre. But the way that it shifted for me after my move was that then I was thrust into this place of like what I and others, especially people in the States, I should say, would perceive as scarcity. ¿Verdad? Pela, limited resources, limited opportunities, pissed off, disgruntled in my cave, in isolation, and having to learn at that point that what I believed to be a space of scarcity was filled with all sorts of abundance that I could not recognize because I was coming at it from a colonial lens, from the conditioning of the colonizer, the conditioning coming from having been born and raised in the belly of the beast in Brooklyn. Pues lo que yo pensaba era tan pelada y esto. There were new ways and new currencies that I had to start seeing and learning and working with and embodying that came from the land itself. And then I started to listen and understand that what I was needing to know was going to be told to me by the land itself. Now that's some shit because, not all of us have a practice. Oh, no, vamos a sentar y meditar y reflexionar sobre el agua, whatever. But it just happened. It wasn't a practice. It wasn't a meditative practice. It wasn't a spiritual practice. It was just a humble, deliberate intention to be still with her and listen. And that's when all these messages started to come. And the way that they were most manifest for me was just through my thoughts. And then I started to write them. Trinchera de Ideas, these gatherings every third Thursday, stems from the idea that versus me entering into these conversations with folks one-on-one, that at some point we should start gathering more intentionally and collectively a intercambiar esas ideas. What are the things that we're arriving at? What are the lessons that we're being brought to from these elements? How do they differ? How do they compare? How are they the same? There are these patterns. We may not realize them. We may or may not be having these conversations in a collective context. And so how do we now do this as a way to start gathering and recording what some of these things are, apuntándola, because then we start to realize within ourselves when we discuss, like, oh, I lived that same experience. I had that same thought. That's a strategy that I picked up, or I learned that from my vecino, or this prima told me that. And like that, we can start to harness that light. We can start to harness esos saberes, esas ideas, esos conocimientos, esa estrategia, which are all essentially decolonial strategies. Because anytime you are aligning to your homeland and the essence of the land itself, then you are listening to its original essence, its raw essence. It's not coming from school books that are told in the voice or the lens of yay number of colonizers. Before having the event, I was looking through the book Silt by Aurora Levins Morales, who returned to the lands that she was born and raised on in Maricao. And Silt is a spectacular book of prose poems. And in it, I was looking for a poem that would speak to land as our source, right? Meditating on the root chakra. That's what I was going through the book, searching, because the concept of silt and mud, as she writes about. And so then by accident, I come across When I Write Archipelago. And I wasn't even thinking about that piece. And I was looking for a piece that I could share in a class that I was going to start the night before the Archipelago conversation. And while looking through the book, come across the perfect piece to be sharing when I write Archipelago, she calls it. So I asked her if I could share it that night, knowing that she wouldn't be able to be with us that night, if it would be okay for me to read it, which thankfully she agreed. But to start that quote, that paragraph, it's a paragraph. The islands I write are more than water-bordered lands. They are mountain ranges rooted in salt water, bones of connection, visible only from the air. I was going to open up with this passage and then instead decided that I would read it later. We started the conversation, and within that conversation, folks were already talking about the connectivity of the islands underneath the water, them being these mountaintops and ranges, and so many things that folks were seeing that echoed what I knew to be in Getzia's video speaking to the archipelago and in Aurora's passage speaking to the archipelago. So I instead ended with the passage. And when I did, folks, that was the response folks had. Like, had you planned that? Like, did you know you were going to start with that? Or just recognizing how her passage echoed what was being discussed. So one of the things that came up in our archipelago conversation is the idea of colonial education always reducing us into an inferior existence and being smaller. And as Getsia says it in her conversation, in her interview that I did at CucubaNación in March, there's a part where I ask her about el archipelago y agua, and connecting those two concepts. And that piece of the interview is actually available on a video on the Rematriating Boriken YouTube channel. And one of my favorite quotes that she shares is, somos archipiélago, pero nos fuerzan a ser islas. Nos fuerzan a ese aislamiento. So the translation of that, we are an archipelago, but they force us to be islands. They force us into that isolation. It's very interesting too to consider just unpacking that word. Aislamiento, isolation. Aislamiento. It's like you're literally being island. Like if island is an act, is a verb. To be island, to be aislado, is to be cut off, isolated. Isolated coming from isle, right? And so Getsia speaks to how we are this chain, and subterraneously or underwater, mejor dicho, this range of mountains of which we are the peaks is connected completely, right? We're also taught to look at islands by their physical boundaries, their physical borders, which would be the edge and the coastline, because colonialism has taught us to look at places as whether or not they could be occupied. And because we as humans need to be on land, then the focus is on that which is occupiable, that which is conquerable. Our ancestors, our indigenous ancestors, as navigators, right? When we talk about canoe, first of all, I'm recording this in English, canoe coming from the Arawak canoa. So a word that is native to these islands and this archipelago, the expansive archipelago of the Caribbean. We usually think of a canoe as like this romantic image that is given to us as children of like a couple paddling a canoe on a lake or something. But some of these canoes can pack like 100 people deep. right? So these were folks navigating across seas, across waterways, some of these treacherous. So needing to know the currents, needing to understand these waterways for them to travel from their source on the southern continent to leaving and traveling up the chain of islands. One of the things that was mentioned in the conversation was Thalia speaking to these land bridges when the sea levels were lower, right? So or these sandbars that you can see, as Thalia pointed out, that you could actually see them uh, if you go to Google Earth. If you look at the Puerto Rico Trench on any of these aerial maps like Google Earth or even Google Maps, satellite view, you're going to see this darkness where the depths or the floor just plummets 28,000 feet as it does with the Puerto Rico Trench. So to see the sandbars where formerly land bridges would exist would be a lot lighter because it's so shallow. And so this idea of seeing ourselves as islands, as cut off, as independent of one another, as separate of one another versus the totality of a body of islands and the connecting waters in between. So that's something that I received upon moving here. It's not looking at water o el charco as the separation between us, sino los puentes, lo que nos conecta, what that fluidity that we must embody. Like Bruce Lee says, right? Be water, that fluidity that we must embody to transcend this idea of smallness, of inferiority that's been imposed on us by colonialism. What it means to forge a sovereignty individually and collectively for Boricuas. This idea of reducing us into an island colony, one island, allows this impression, imposes actually this impression that we are much smaller. The focus on the 135 as the nautical miles of this one island. Nautical miles meaning flat miles of the sea that don't take into consideration the elevations of a land. And so with our Cordillera Central and different ranges of hills, from the karst to the north to the hills of the southwest that actually originated in rocks from the Pacific Ocean. They're the most ancient rock that exists on this island, La Isla Grande. If we take all those elevations and ascents and descents de cuantos monte y lomas hay por todo Puerto Rico, somos más que 100 por 35. The other thing to consider is that then all these 100 plus islas, cayos, what have you, different islands spread throughout this cluster of the greater Caribbean archipelago. Now, everyone focuses on Puerto Rico as an island, referencing the big island or La Isla Grande, the same way Hawaii, and that being an archipelago, has its big island. Aquí, la gente de Puerto Rico dicen La Isla Grande, which is quite literally big island. When you are in Las Islas Municipio, en Vieques y Culebra, la gente de Vieques y Culebra van a decir La Isla Grande. We focus on Vieques y Culebra because they're the inhabited islands, the larger inhabited islands. So there are 3 inhabited islands, but then like countless others, like Mona, Caja de Muertos, which are larger ones, and then a whole assortment of other little islands that may not have people living on them, but have wildlife and other things going on there. And that people travel to. And all of this speaks to an expanse, right? And if we move beyond those nautical miles, beyond el 100 por 35, into the waters that exist between us and these other islands, the various waterways, el pasaje de la Mona to the west, which is the beaches that I frequent. To the east, you have el pasaje de Anegada, which Anegada, people may reference as an island of the Virgin Islands. And so that waterway to the west is named for the Virgin Islands. If we talk about the elevations of the mountains that we have here, La Cordillera Central, then the inverse of those are the trenches and troghs. So the Muertos Trough to the south and the Puerto Rico Trench to the north, which is actually the second deepest part of the Earth's crust, and the deepest part of the Atlantic Ocean, which exists 70 miles to the north of us. And this is the reality of what todo lo que Puerto Rico embarca. Like, what is Puerto Rico when we think of space and when we think of islands as plural and waterways as plural? And that's just focusing here before we even venture out into the conversation of the diaspora, and also to consider that the diaspora is not just the United States with that one charco, which is that little strip of Atlantic between the islands of Puerto Rico and the United States. The diaspora is global and encompasses so many charcos, ¿verdad? So many of the parts of the Atlantic, like the Northern Atlantic, if you consider Betances, who lived most of his life in France, and Segundo Ruiz Belvis, who passed in Chile, and Eugenio Maria de Hostos, who lived and traveled around South America and whose remains still to this day are in la zona colonial, como se llama, como le dicen, en Santo Domingo, en la República Dominicana. So when we consider all of these things, then Puerto Rico is anything but small or little. So there's a meme that I created and would circulate on social media about colonialism got us, like, right? And we call Manhattan is the Big Apple, pero Vieques es la isla nena, the little girl island, as it's referred to. And supposedly the name Vieque, the indigenous Arawak name of Vieques, which Vieques being the Castilianized version of Vieque, y Vieque means small island. Eso para los taínos era pequeño. But Vieques is it could roughly amount to twice the size of Manhattan. And no one is going to talk about that, because Manhattan, doesn't matter. It's tiny nautical miles, or it's really few nautical miles. It's the idea of, but the population, but the elevations of skyscrapers and all the people that are in there, a lot of them things are empty right now. All of these things, and the way that colonialism and colonial capitalism has us taking anything white and imperial and stamping this massive concept. It's this massiveness, grande, junky, and then lo nuestro, lo boricua, chiquito, whatever. So this is where I start this fascination with what Archipelago is, beyond me taking map and globe study skills was a little segment of a class that we took in 4th grade in East New York, Brooklyn at PS 108, and studying maps and stuff, which I loved. I actually contemplated being a cartographer. And so moving way beyond that to really consider what archipelago means and to consider this as part of our reality, part of our present day existence and our ancestral existence. If we recognize that the only navigators were not the conquerors, the only navigators were not the Spanish conquistadores, the original navigators were our indigenous ancestors of this whole Caribbean basin, navigating in their canoas from one island to the next, making it up as far as the Bahamas and shores of Florida, down, having come from the northern shores of South America, having navigated from the peninsula of Yucatan, and these were the navigators, right? Our indigenous history and presence on these islands is thousands and thousands of years old. Our history did not begin with Columbus's expeditions in 1493 to this particular Isla Grande. Y es la importancia entonces de traer una nueva conciencia que no es tan nueva, pero es como si fuera nueva porque no, it doesn't catch this idea of an archipelagic consciousness is so isolated and is not widely embraced, and that needs to change. How do we forge a new archipelagic sovereignty for ourselves? So many speak of the independence of Puerto Rico, referring to it as an island and as a colony. And so what does it mean to reframe that conversation into one in which we are an expanse of islands spread across waters? There are other archipelagic nations where recognizing one's sovereignty transcends the idea of being isolated, aislados, coming from islands, right? But rather being connected by the many waterways running between those islands, connected as a chain of islands whose peaks are what go above the surface of the water, and that those lands continue beneath the waters, connecting to the next and the next and the next island. And therefore, being an archipelagic nation means that being an archipelagic sovereignty also means that you claim sovereignty over your maritime space. So the interesting thing is that these colonizers, for all the places invaded and taken, like Puerto Rico by the US, in the 19th century, late 19th century, when everything was happening via the navies, where there were coaling stations set up across the earth for these naval vessels. The conquerors came by water, and their entire thing was traveling across waters to claim new lands and conquer them. And so it is not thinking in those terms in the sense of marking territory and jurisdiction and sea, maritime space, I should say, and airspace and all of that these nations do, that certainly the imperialists do. But to say that as a people, we have a right to preside as the stewards of lands and waters, these spaces, and that in doing so, then our home is something that we've long known, which is that it is way more expansive than the colonial borders imposed upon us, because borders, in this sense of stamping them and imposing them over the earth, are mere limits, which is literalmente lo que dicen, los límites, cuando se habla de territorio, cuando se habla de municipio, los límites, y aquí colindamos con Aguadilla y Aguada, ¿verdad? Tales cosas. So it is limiting to see the borders being the geographical borders of the coastline when we know that if we are on the eastern side of Puerto Rico and you look out to the horizon towards the northeast, you will see Culebra. And if you look out towards the horizon to the southeast, you will see Vieques on the horizon. And so why would those beaches across Fajardo, Ceiba, Humacao, Naguabo, Yabucoa, why would those be los límites cuando continúan en esas aguas el pasaje de Anegada, que en esas aguas están Culebra y Vieques, y si uno sigue por esas aguas se va a encontrar con las Islas Vírgenes, right? So this expansiveness and this connectivity, not just for Puerto Rico, but the entire Caribbean chain of islands, in reflecting on another island nation. And there are various, like the Bahamas or any number of island nations and archipelagic nations across the Pacific. Some that I think of right now that are clustered together, like Guam and Northern Mariana Islands, are another colony of the U.S., or another, what should be an archipelagic nation. Hawaii is actually made into a state of the U.S. But right now I'm thinking about the Philippines and some historic bochinche about the Philippines is that the Philippines were made independent. Not made independent, but there was a law that led to Philippine independence. And I'm speaking about this from the imperialistic history of U.S. colonialism, not undermining the struggle of the Filipinos to liberate themselves. There was a bill called, I believe, the Tidings, right, Act 1936, which led to the Philippine independence. Around that time, there was a chief of police in Puerto Rico, Elijah Francis Riggs, who was assassinated because of all the violence that was happening, colonial violence in Puerto Rico, that the Nationalist Party started to avenge or act in self-defense. Riggs was a friend of Millard Tydings. When he was assassinated, Millard Tydings, who was a politician from Maryland, decided that they should offer, under this same act, independence to Puerto Rico. This is all my own paraphrase, and everything that I say here, you should go and look further and corroborate wherever you'd like. Tidings is capital Tydings. Millard, Millard. Millard Tydings is the name of the politician who created this act that eventually led to Philippine independence. And what was being offered was an independence to Puerto Rico, pero a la cañona. The concept of an independence process is that it be a political decolonial process. A decolonial process expands way beyond, I should say, a decolonization process, right? So a decolonial process speaks to something much more expansive than just political decolonization. But the idea was ofrecerle la independencia a Puerto Rico a la cañona, meaning there would be no process of transition. But the concept is that if an imperial power comes in and takes over a country and reduces its currency by half its value, as happened to the Puerto Rican peso upon the arrival of the US, if it does away with its economy by destroying the crops that were most prized in international markets, like Puerto Rican coffee in 1898 when they arrived, if it does away with, say, the autonomous charter that had been issued by Spain and that Puerto Rico was under when the United States came, then if you have done away with all these things and implemented martial law for the first 2 years, and several decades of U.S. governors who had no idea anything about Puerto Rico, governing Puerto Rico, and so much more, and imposed English in its school system and court system, and all the ways that colonialism deliberately works to undo the essence of a place, then it would be lovely to consider that the process of pulling out and decolonizing would be one in which certain amenities are offered in that transitional period before pulling out cold turkey. But there's nothing lovely about colonialism. And so it was decided that Puerto Rico, who was, of course, coming out of this whole impact of the Depression, y como se dice cuando en los Estados Unidos hay resfriado, aquí en Puerto Rico tienen pulmonía, then it was decided that this independence would be a death sentence. That's what was decided. And it was also described that it is where Luis Muñoz Marin's Pan, Tierra y Libertad concept was born, where he moves from being a socialist to being this orchestrator or co-conspirator, I should say, collaborator of the transitory colonial plan, which is to bring Puerto Rico into the so-called free associated state, which is actually an oxymoron. And so thinking back to the Philippines and other archipelagic sovereignties across this globe, and it's not to say that sovereignties across the globe haven't had to mitigate all these imperial influences through time, even after independence. But what would it mean for Puerto Rico to move beyond envisioning everything for itself from behind a lens of US colonialism, where everything that is discussed ever in Puerto Rico is envisioned behind a colonial US lens? When our own diaspora visits here, this archipelago, and even the people who have always lived here or who have gone back and forth and get upset when Puerto Rico is not enough like the States, doesn't have the same amenities as the States. When has a colony ever been equal to its colonizer? And in many respects, that comparison is unrealistic, as you're comparing two completely different entities. And so we can never compare ourselves with something that we can never be. And it's not to say that we can never be because Puerto Rico can never be the US, like the US is so grand. It's like, I don't want to be the US because we have our own identity and essence. Why would I need to replicate anyone else's? And what is the US essence anyway, if not a collage, a hybrid, slapped together Mod Podge of just all sorts of global influences? I'm speaking of the US essence for everything that political entity embodies. I'm not speaking of Turtle Island, because if we really want to speak to the essence of those lands, then that's where that essence would lie. The soils of Turtle Island, there are many sacred waters within and without and all around, and the wide diversity of their First Nation peoples, from coast to coast, from north to south. What would it be to instead look to various indigenous peoples across the globe who have made their archipelagic reality and essence the basis and the core of their sovereignty, so that their sovereignty is not a replication or replica of their colonizer. It is a formalizing, if you will, for lack of a better term, of what they've always been and what they've always known, of their essence. It is in the middle of these times in humanity where all must be labeled and identified, demarcated and categorized. That if this is how humanity needs to play today, that if we haven't yet ascended into the free state of existing peacefully on this planet without flags or borders, that the way we organize and identify be determined not by other people coming from other seas with other weapons and other technologies, but that it be defined by the essence of the soils beneath our feet and the waters that saturate them. And so that is what I mean when I say archipelago. And that is what I mean, and that is what I think of, and that is what I envision and dream when I say an archipelagic sovereignty. And there's so many cases across the globe where these have long been in existence. And what I mean is that it's time to reclaim ours. Thank you so much for listening to the Rematriating Boriken podcast. This is Yasmín Hernández. For more information on the Rematriating Boriken project, you can visit Rematriating Borikén, that's BORIKEN.com. Thanks again for listening.